Welcome to Unit 3 of this training, Supervision, Meeting the Needs of CPSs in a System of Flux. In the last section, we talked about the transitioning of the system from a medical-based or maintenance-based model to one focused on recovery. We ended by briefly mentioning the leadership challenges facing supervisors. In this next section, we'll be talking in a greater length about peer workers and CPSs, how the profession began, what the profession is, what training people receive, what competencies they develop, and how these fit into the traditional workforce. This information will help you see the leadership challenges more clearly, but hopefully will also give you the tools you need to take on and enjoy this leadership role. So let's talk more about peer specialists and peer practice. Peer practice grows directly out of what's known today as the peer movement. This has also been called the consumer survivor ex-patient movement, or quote, C/X/X movement, as you may see it in the literature. The tenets and values of a peer specialist have their roots in the long history of peer-to-peer support, advocacy, and activism by people who have found recovery with and without the use of mental health systems, and sometimes despite the help of the medical professionals. From the day when asylums were first opened, we get the stories of people like John Henry Percival, who wrote his book called A Narrative of the Treatment Experienced by a Gentleman, or the story of Elizabeth Packard, who was institutionalized for more than 3 years for simply having different religious views than her husband. In 1908, Clifford Beers wrote his book, A Mind That Found Itself. This led to societies and leagues to investigate the abuses within the mental health system, to improve treatment, and eventually leading to the formation of the National Association of Mental Health, now known as Mental Health America. And in the 60s and 70s, right here in Massachusetts, people like Judy Chamberlain and Pat Deegan, Steve Holochuk, and Isaiah Eulis, Deborah Delman, and John Delman were all active in various activities to change the face of mental health treatment. As each got involved in their own ways in activism, working within the system to transform the system, demanding that the voices of lived experience be represented at the tables where mental health transformation was being discussed, and ensuring that the voice of people using services guided the changes. A core piece of the movement has been the mantra, "Nothing about us without us," because it's the people in recovery who have experienced both illness and treatment and recovery that can best tell the story of what it was like to receive treatment, what worked, what didn't, and what might have worked better. Massachusetts has made continuous groundbreaking efforts since the early 1990s to introduce and expand peer roles in the mental health workforce. Early efforts were hampered by the lack of funding streams, but nonetheless, in 1993, the state hired Steve Holochuk to run the new DMH Office of Consumer Affairs. The Consumer Provider Program was begun in 1993 and was a nationally known year-long program treating people with lived experience to become mental health workers. In 1999, the Peer Educators Project, run by Mo Armstrong, began to focus on the peer-to-peer relationship rather than preparing people to fill traditional roles. And in 2002, MBHP replicated a peer role created by NIAPRAS, that hired people with lived experience to support others as they transitioned out of long-term hospitals and residential settings, bridging the transition by working with people starting several months before discharge and continuing to work with them through the first 3 to 6 months of community living. In 2002, the state also began to require peer specialists on PACT teams. Again, this role was meant to bring the voice of lived experience to the clinical team and people using services. This was the first time the state attempted to integrate clinical and non-clinical roles within teams. Many lessons were learned from the early experiences, including the recognition that roles for peer specialists needed to be clearly defined for both the person in that role and the rest of the team, and that teams needed to be prepared for the introduction of the role, and that the mere fact that someone has lived experience doesn't necessarily make them prepared or particularly suited for the job of peer specialists. Peer debriefers were added in 2004 as the state tried to make changes to restraint and seclusion policies. And finally, in 2006, the first certified peer specialist class was held. It wasn't until Georgia and Arizona were successful in achieving and sharing the route to Medicaid funding for CPS positions that states like Massachusetts were able to seriously consider a significant peer workforce. Since the first class in 2006, more than 350 people have become certified peer specialists in Massachusetts. Training certified peer specialists was just the first step in creating a peer workforce. The CBFS redesign created dedicated roles within provider settings, and this was expanded to emergency services as well when MBHP restructured their funding. And finally, in 2011, after incredible efforts by DMH, CPS positions were created under the state union contract, allowing state-operated services to hire CPSs as well. When the peer workforce was first emerging in Massachusetts, it was anticipated that there would be several peer roles introduced into the public mental health system. The Transformation Committee, or TRANSCOM, created an advisory paper for DMH entitled Peers as Valued Workers, a Massachusetts roadmap for successfully integrating peer specialists and peer workers into the public mental health system. We just call it the roadmap for short. 2 discrete roles were outlined: certified peer specialists and peer support workers, with the expectation that this would be the beginning of a robust ladder of peer roles in the mental health system and beyond. When the CPS course was introduced, however, energies and resources became focused on this role and others fell to the side. Over time, the CPS became the only supported position, and people expected the CPS training to prepare everyone across the continuum of experience. As a supervisor, it is important to recognize the differences between these roles. A peer worker is typically someone with lived experience who wishes to inspire hope in others through the sharing of their own stories of recovery. It was anticipated that peer workers would be working with and under the tutelage of CPSs, so they could be oriented to the basic values and tenets of peer work. What has happened more often is that peer support workers have been hired based on their lived experience alone and without consideration of other skills needed to perform the work. They've been supervised by people who have not had any experience with or understanding of peer practice, and their jobs have often become similar to mental health worker positions. Some peer workers are very successful, having the innate skills needed to support others. Some are good workers as well, depending on the opportunities they've had in life to develop their worker roles. The range of what is expected of people in these positions goes from very little to the full expectation of a certified peer specialist. The lack of definition, job requirements, clear job descriptions consistent with peer practice, and clinical supervision has sometimes led to confusion and frustration for all people involved. CPSs, on the other hand, are trained in peer practice, which we'll explore in depth in just a moment. In addition, the structure of the training requires a person to have some basic work skills, such as being able to be at class every day, navigate transportation, maintain attention over an 8-hour day, and effectively problem solve, as well as initiate conversation about difficulties and meet all the requirements of the course. So what is peer practice? The term peer specialist is an intentional name meant to indicate the peerness between people using services and people providing peer support. Peer is a relational term signifying similarities between people in areas such as history, background, role, age, etc. We all have many peer relationships in our lives. The significance of the term with the peer specialist role has become clouded as more and more the term peer is erroneously being used to identify anyone with lived experience. For example, she's a peer, meaning that she's a person who is currently receiving services, or has received them in the past, or has a diagnosis. In effect, the word used this way is becoming the new version of the catch-all term consumer. In this course, we'll only speak of peers as peer workers who work in relationship with those who have a shared lived experience. The relationship is critical. A key lesson learned over and over in groups like the alleged Lunatics Friends Society and Mental Health Liberation Front is the healing power of connection with others surviving and recovering. This is a core component brought from the movement to the present. Similarly, the advocacy stance of the early groups also comes into present practice, but with more of a bridging than activism perspective. Current peer practice also draws on the rich history of story sharing to inspire hope and dispel myths, especially those that frame emotional distress as chronic, debilitating, lifelong brain illnesses that can only be mediated through the use of medication. Presenting the full picture of possibilities such as trauma and environmental impact in causing distress opens up doors to hope that might be closed by the quote persistently mental ill close quote perspective. Peer practice also connects with the movement's role in advocating for basic civil rights in relationship to mental health treatment. A great example of this is the work done here in Massachusetts by Empower that led to the passage of the 5 fundamental rights of people hospitalized. These are in your workbook. Still using the mantra, nothing about us without us, CPSs and peer workers still push for a place at the table. For example, when the state was responding to the tragic death of Stephanie Moulton, people with lived experience attempted to balance out some of the initial proposals, stripping people of any dignity of respect. So current peer practice, as it relates to CPSs and peer worker roles, has direct links to the rich history of the peer movement by using our stories, our experiences, how it felt, how actions were perceived from the service user perspective, to ensure that we don't revert to an inhumane system and continue to move forward towards recovery orientation. The system faced by Clifford Beers was different from the one that John Henry Percival experienced. And the system we work with today is far different and greatly improved from the one endured by Pat Deegan and Judy Chamberlain. But the work continues nonetheless. In 2003, the Presidential New Freedom Commission reported that our mental health system is a, quote, patchwork relic of fragmented and inadequate services, and that a, quote, fundamental transformation of the nation's approach to mental health care is necessary. Recognizing that recovery is a concrete reality given the right combination, the Commission found that our current system simply manages symptoms and accepts long-term disability rather than facilitates a recovery-oriented approach. In light of these findings, it recommended that services be consumer and family-driven as well as recovery-oriented. This is in part because the stories of lived experience is so vital to our changing system. It is the stories that can override old beliefs and old paradigms, because the stories of real life and real people touch us in a different way. For people using services, there is nothing more powerful than hearing someone say, "Been there, done that," and moved beyond, to inspire hope to a different life. It plants the seeds that say, "I can change." It can help change beliefs that are set like concrete that say, "I am forever broken." These internal dialogues can determine the path a person takes towards or away from a different future. Peer practice, or that role of being peer to people using services, also provides a mechanism to explore options, directions, thoughts, etc. with someone who doesn't have or isn't perceived to have power over them. All of us as human beings have different conversations with those who have power over, roll with us, and those who are just our peers. The level playing field provides a safety that someone may not experience with the traditional staff, and this can open the door to many meaningful discoveries. And finally, there's also nothing as powerful in determining the positive or negative impact of service models, interventions, and practices than hearing it from those who actually received the services. CPSs, again, have the stories of lived experience to explain, not in statistical numbers, but on an emotional level, how things did or didn't facilitate forward movement. It is within this context that peer specialists work to first and foremost support people using services to see a more hopeful future in a self-determined life, while also supporting the system to see things that people might not notice due to their own immersion in how things have always been done. Having the voice of someone who's been on the receiving end of interventions, providers and policymakers can also be better informed in how services actually impact people's sense of wellness and self-efficacy in life. Certified peer specialist work is guided by their code of ethics. The first and most important ethic is that, quote, the primary responsibility of certified peer specialists is to help individuals achieve what they want most in life, their own goals, needs, and wants. Certified peer specialists will be guided by the principle of self-determination for all. The CPS course also teaches specific competencies necessary to fulfill the role. One category of competencies is that of peer support. Those competencies needed to provide meaningful one-on-one support to people using services. CPSs also serve as change agents in the system and learn the skills to do this hard work, not as activists criticizing the system from outside the door, but instead from within the system as a bridger and ally to other staff, supporting the process of change to recovery. Finally, CPSs strive to maintain their peerness in order to effectively perform their work, both literally and in spirit. These competencies fall under what is known as being in but not of the system. So as we see, the CPS role is a non-clinical role with its roots in the peer movement and its primary tool being the use of one's lived experience. This is not to say that a CPS is just a storyteller. Skilled sharing of experience combined with support, listening, etc. is really a rather complex job. In the next unit, we'll cover all the modules that CPSs study in their course and how CPS work looks when we put it into daily practice. Thank you for joining us for this module, and I look forward to seeing you in the next round. Bye-bye.